The first change happens before you even notice for many people. Bread is not just food. It is routine. Toast in the morning, a sandwich at lunch, a roll with dinner. Sometimes it is so automatic that you barely register how often it appears on the plate. Now imagine removing it for 21 days. Not reducing it, not replacing it with a smaller portion. Completely removing it. Most people expect the first change to be weight loss. But that is rarely the first thing that happens inside the IOD. The first shift is metabolic. Bread made from refined wheat breaks down quickly into glucose. This produces a rapid rise in blood sugar. In response, the pancreas releases insulin to move that glucose out of circulation. When this pattern repeats multiple times every day, the body becomes accustomed to frequent glucose spikes followed by insulin surges. When bread is suddenly removed, that cycle begins to change. Within the first several days, glucose fluctuations become smaller. Insulin release becomes less dramatic. For some people, this produces a noticeable difference in energy stability. Instead of the mid-afternoon fatigue that often follows a high-carbohydrate meal, energy levels begin to feel more consistent. There is also an early neurological effect. Refined carbohydrates stimulate dopamine release in the brain. This is one reason bread and baked foods feel comforting. When they are removed, the brain temporarily notices the absence of that stimulation. This is why the first few days can feel surprisingly difficult. Some people describe mild cravings or a feeling that something is missing from their usual meals. But beneath those cravings, a quieter physiological shift is beginning. Blood sugar regulation is stabilizing. Insulin exposure is decreasing. The body is beginning to rely less on rapid carbohydrate energy and more on a balanced mixture of stored glycogen and fat metabolism. Nothing dramatic has happened yet on the outside. But internally, the metabolic environment has already started to change. The first week, blood sugar and hunger begin to stabilize by the end of the first week. Something subtle but important usually begins to happen. Your appetite pattern starts to change. Bread and other refined grain products digest rapidly. They convert to glucose quickly and trigger a strong insulin response. After that surge, blood sugar often drops again. When this drop happens, the brain interprets it as a need for more food. That cycle can repeat several times a day. When bread is removed for a full week, that rapid spike and drop pattern becomes less frequent. Meals that contain more protein, fiber, and healthy fats digest more slowly. Glucose enters the bloodstream at a steadier rate. As a result, insulin release becomes more controlled. This has two noticeable effects. First, hunger signals begin to space out. Many people report that they no longer feel the urgent mid-morning or mid-afternoon need for a snack. Second, energy levels often become more even throughout the day. Instead of the familiar rise and fall that follows high glycemic meals, the body begins operating in a more metabolically stable state. The brain receives a steadier supply of fuel, which can translate into improved focus and fewer moments of sudden fatigue. Another change that sometimes appears during this stage is a reduction in water retention. Refined carbohydrates influence glycogen storage in the liver and muscles. Glycogen binds water inside the body. When carbohydrate intake drops, some of that stored water is released. This is why some individuals notice a modest drop on the scale during the first week. Much of it reflects fluid balance rather than fat loss. Meanwhile, insulin levels continue to decline gradually. Lower insulin allows the body to access stored fat more easily for energy between meals. This shift is small at first, but it marks the beginning of improved metabolic flexibility. By the end of the first week, the body is no longer reacting to bread. It is adapting to life without it. Inflammation and digestion begin to shift by the second week. The body has largely adjusted to the absence of daily refined wheat products. The early cravings tend to fade and a different set of changes begins to appear. One of the most noticeable shifts can occur in digestion. Bread made from refined wheat contains rapidly digestible starches and, for some individuals, gluten proteins that may contribute to low-grade intestinal irritation. This does not mean everyone is intolerant, but frequent exposure can still influence digestive comfort and gut signaling. When bread is removed for 2 weeks, the digestive system often operates under less constant carbohydrate fermentation in the upper intestine. Meals built around vegetables, proteins, and slower digesting carbohydrates tend to move through the digestive tract more steadily. Many people describe a reduction in bloating or abdominal heaviness during meal at this stage. There is also a systemic component. Refined carbohydrate intake is closely linked with repeated insulin spikes. Chronically elevated insulin can amplify inflammatory signaling within blood vessels and metabolic tissues. When those spikes become less frequent, inflammatory stress on the endothelium and other tissues may gradually decline. This process is subtle and develops over time. But during the second week, the metabolic environment inside the body becomes calmer. Another change relates to appetite hormones. Stable blood sugar improves signaling between leptin and ghrelin, the hormones that regulate hunger and satiety. When meals are not followed by sharp glucose drops, the brain receives clearer signals about when energy intake is actually needed. For some people, this translates into a surprising experience. Meals begin to feel more satisfying, even if they are not larger. The body is beginning to shift away from the rapid energy cycling created by refined carbohydrates and toward a more balanced metabolic rhythm. Week 3. Metabolic flexibility begins to improve by the 3rd week. The body has had enough time to adapt to a different fuel pattern. At this stage, the most meaningful change is not simply fewer carbohydrates. It is improved metabolic flexibility. Metabolic flexibility refers to the body's ability to shift between glucose and fat as energy sources. When refined bread and other fast-digesting carbohydrates are consumed frequently, the body becomes heavily dependent on glucose as its primary fuel. With constant glucose availability, fat oxidation slows. The body rarely needs to access stored energy. After 2 to 3 weeks without daily refined bread, insulin levels tend to remain lower between meals. Lower insulin allows hormone-sensitive lipase to become more active. This enzyme helps release fatty acids from stored fat tissue. As a result, the body becomes more comfortable using fat for energy during fasting periods, between meals. This change is gradual, but many people begin to notice its effects around this point. Energy levels feel steadier throughout the day. The sharp fatigue that sometimes follows carbohydrate-heavy meals becomes less common. Some individuals also report improved mental clarity, which may be related to more stable glucose availability in the brain. Another effect involves blood lipid patterns. When insulin levels remain lower over time, the liver tends to produce fewer triglyceride-rich particles. This shift can gradually improve lipid metabolism and reduce metabolic strain on blood vessels. Meanwhile, digestive hormones and satiety signals continue to stabilize. Meals that include protein, fiber, and healthy fats trigger slower digestion and longer-lasting fullness signals. This reduces the likelihood of frequent snacking and helps the body maintain a steadier metabolic rhythm. By the 3rd week, the body is no longer reacting to the absence of bread. It has adapted to a different metabolic environment. What the 21-day shift can mean for long-term health by the end of 21 days. The most important change is not simply that bread has been removed from the diet. The more meaningful shift is that the body has had time to operate in a different metabolic environment. Blood sugar fluctuations are often smaller and less frequent. Insulin exposure across the day is reduced. This allows the body to spend more time in a balanced state, rather than constantly moving between rapid glucose spikes and energy crashes. For many people, this translates into steadier appetite control. When glucose and insulin remain more stable, hunger signals tend to become more predictable. Meals feel more satisfying and the urge to snack between them often declines. Over time, this pattern can make calorie intake easier to regulate without strict restriction. Another potential benefit involves vascular health. Repeated high glycemic meals can contribute to oxidative stress inside blood vessels. When those spikes become less frequent, the endothelium, the thin lining of the arteries, experiences less metabolic strain. This supports healthier vascular function over the long term. Weight regulation can also gradually improve. Lower insulin levels allow the body to access stored fat more efficiently between meals. This does not produce dramatic changes overnight, but over time it supports a metabolic environment that favors energy balance rather than constant storage. Important to remember that bread itself is not inherently harmful for everyone. Whole grain varieties can provide fiber and nutrients when consumed in moderation. What this 21-day experiment demonstrates is something broader. When a highly refined, rapidly digestible staple is removed from daily routine, the body often responds with greater metabolic stability. Energy becomes steadier, hunger signals become clearer, insulin demand becomes lower, and sometimes the most valuable insight from those 21 days is simply this. Small, consistent changes in daily food patterns can have measurable effects on how the body regulates energy, metabolism, and long-term health.